Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Always good to be back with you, Eugene.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. Sorry, I just had no choice. It's been a while, maybe. But happy to be here with you as always. It has. And happy to be back with all of you here. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube and you have not already, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you can get all of our fantastic content here at Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Also, make sure you hit the bell so that you get the alerts about all the fantastic Breakthrough News content. So just make it easy on yourself to find all of the fantastic content, because there's a lot of great content coming out from us here at Breakthrough News. So subscribe and hit the bell. Rania, what else should people do?
Well, people can also support the show by becoming patrons at patreon.com/breakthrough news, which helps support all of our wonderful programming here at Breakthrough News and helps to make it better. So I won't stumble over my words. If you want me to stop doing that, become a patron. Also, you can donate. You can do a one-time donation. If you look below YouTube, there's an option to donate. You can push that donate button there and support us that way as well. Lots coming up for you guys. So it's only possible to keep it coming with support from our viewers and our listeners.
Yes, indeed. Plenty coming for you. We'll be talking about the Xi-Putin meeting. We'll be talking about issues in India and issues happening in Pakistan. We're talking about U.S. policies towards Cuba. So many things to say. But, one of the places I wanted to start real quick before we turn to our first issue, Rania, is the views of other people in the world on the war in Ukraine, which, is something that you don't see that often. So I'll maybe half tip my hat to CNN for putting together a segment asking just regular people, working class people in China, what they thought about the war in Ukraine and some of the broader issues right on the eve of President Xi going to meet President Putin in Moscow.
I've been talking to people in this Hutong, this old Beijing residential alley, to get a sense of what Chinese people think about Xi Jinping's visit.
This man tells me Xi's visit is good because it can further improve China-Russia relations. He says he likes Putin a lot because he's a cool, tough guy. On the Ukraine war, he says he just hopes everyone can have a peaceful relationship. This woman tells me she hopes Russia wins the war, but peace is best. Another woman says the war and loss of life is heartbreaking and painful to watch. She says it's wrong for America to send weapons to Ukraine, and she believes in Xi Jinping's vision of world peace. When I ask her what she thinks of Putin, she answers that he's righteous, decisive, swift, and tough. But when I follow up and ask if she's heard of the ICC issuing an arrest warrant for Putin, she responds, "I didn't know. He started the war after all. He should sit down with Zelensky and talk." This shoe repairman says, why are they fighting? It doesn't do anybody good. But we don't know who started the war, he adds. It's the Ukrainians, right?
Well, obviously a little, sharp elbows here in a way, but I think it's an important statement. I mean, this is the world's most populous country, obviously playing a huge role. We're constantly told that Xi Jinping is just some authoritarian dictator and everyone in China wishes they lived in an American-style society. But they're, certainly a different view than what we see in the Western media in terms of how people view Ukraine, but also I think a sense that, the direction by the president of China is in line with a lot of the people of China.
Right. And I'm sure that those kinds of comments for CNN viewers might have sounded blasphemous. But in reality, that's how a lot of the world feels. Those are actually comments that you would get around the world. In some cases, you'd get even more like staunchly pro-Russia comments that would be quite shocking for American ears, because we're just like bombarded with one message over and over again by a corporate media apparatus that wants, that's very one-sided when it comes to this. But yeah, and whether it's China, whether it's across the Middle East, whether it's across Latin America or Africa, you're going to have a much more maybe nuanced view, ranging from nuanced to, like, again, staunchly pro-Russia. And, you know, it's good for Americans to hear that, even if it was for just a few minutes on CNN, because at least it makes you reflect, if only for a moment, on the fact that, like, there's a whole world out there that thinks a bit differently about this war.
Yes. Well, everyone sitting in an airport must have seen it. But on that note,
or any hotel across America.
Yes, indeed. But just wanted to share that with you here. And of course, we'll be coming back to the Xi Putin meeting later in the show. So feel free to let everyone know that we are here. We are live on the Freedom Side. And we want to turn to our first story here. A recent big victory by farmers in the state, in one of the states of India, Maharashtra, were embarking on a long march. They were going to go 250 kilometers, but stopped before they ended because the state government there met their demands. So to talk more about this interesting victory, the situation for farmers and people living in rural areas in India, we are very, very happy to be joined by Vikas Rawal, who is a professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU in New Delhi. Professor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, my first question is I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the conditions for farmers in India that would lead them to take, I think, what many people around the world would consider a very drastic step, to march 250 kilometers.
And I would like to give you the context in two respects. One is that if some of the viewers have been following news from India, over the last few years, there have been several very, very large-scale mobilizations of farmers. There was a similar long march in 2018, which caught the headlines. And then in 2020-21, there was a year-long sit-in on the outskirts of Delhi by hundreds of thousands of farmers. For over a year, they sat on the borders of the capital city against three new laws that had been enacted by the national government, taking advantage of the COVID pandemic situation and the lockdown that had been imposed because of that. Now, why have farmers in India been protesting at this way in such large numbers? One need to understand the crisis that agriculture has been facing for some time now, but particularly over the last few years, because of the policies of structural adjustment in particular, which have resulted in agriculture becoming highly unremunerative. Indian farmers are very small farmers. They own land, sometimes, and most of them own land less than 1 hectare. But between and rarely beyond 2 or 3 hectares of land, farmers have been incurring losses. Farmers have been incurring making very little incomes out of agriculture, and that has been the bane of agrarian crisis in India. One of the major problems that Indian farmers face is that they work in an environment of uncertainty. And I think this is a problem that farmers in the third world at large face, that when you decide to grow a particular crop, you don't know how much price your crop is going to fetch. And with increasing integration with the world markets, these prices fluctuate hugely. So you can have a situation where you've worked on your land for 3, 4, 5 months, and then it's not even worth harvesting your crop because the prices that the crop's going to fetch is so little that it does not even cover the labor for harvesting the crop, leave aside all the expenses that you've incurred. This has been often the case with the onion crop, and that's the problem that led to the recent decision by farmers in Maharashtra, which is one of the major onion producers, to march to Mumbai and demand the government to provide a guarantee of minimum prices for onions. So, that's really the context in which the recent march happened.
Were quite successful in getting at least some of their demands met. So can you talk a bit about, India's government is a very neoliberal government, very much, against making concessions to workers or peasants in this case. So what exactly did these farmers do in order to make their demands heard? And how did they reach this victory?
So, you see, the farmers started marching towards Mumbai. 15,000 farmers, a contingent of about 15,000 farmers were marching towards Delhi. And this obviously resulted in the developing cold feet, because this had happened in 2018 and they marched right through Mumbai that year, and they entered the city of Mumbai and laid siege to the city. In 2020, when it happened in New Delhi, hundreds of thousands of farmers on their tractors reached the capital city, breaking concrete barriers and boulders and whatnot, and braving water cannons, tear gas shells, and so on. They reached the border of New Delhi, and they laid siege to the city for over. They didn't lay siege to the city. They were stopped at the borders of the capital city. They stayed there for 1 year, over 1 year. They remained there. So this prospect that farmers can fight, they can fight hard, they can. They will stay. They will stay here. They will. So all of these have been completely non-violent protests, large scale, and required an incredible resolve by farmers to brave winters and summers and rain and whatnot. So the recent history of this, that farmers can actually do this. If their demands are not met, they will stay together and they'll fight long and hard. I think was what led to government developing cold feet. They just didn't want them to land up in Mumbai, and therefore they obviously came forward to have talks. There was a delegation of the leaders of this group which met with the government. So they started their march on the 12th. On the 16th of March, they had their meeting with the government, and the government accepted their demands. But the march stopped and waited. They did not suspend their agitation. They waited until the decisions that they had come to were placed before the Legislative Assembly of the state, and the announcement was formally made that the government would provide compensation to farmers until the government would. So all the decisions that had been reached with the farmers were formally announced, and once that happened on the 17th, the farmers gave a call to withdraw their agitation.
One of the things that I noticed is that there were a number of students who were assisting the farmers, civil society, people along the way, trying to, help them on this long march. And, that also seemed to be similar as, a couple years ago in this great revolt of farmers that you mentioned. It seems that the struggle of the farmers has also really touched a deeper nerve, maybe, of people in India about, injustice and inequality. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think you're right. There has been a growing discontent among workers, among students. Students have faced assault in the public universities in India, across all public universities in India. So there's been this sort of the assault by this neoliberal government on public universities, on systems of public education at large, and on the workers. So there has been this, fundamental condition which has resulted in all of them coming together and protesting independently, but also protesting together. For example, on April 5th, there is a big rally being organized in New Delhi by the workers, by the peasants, by the industrial workers, and by the agricultural workers together, a united action to protest against the assault on their livelihood. So you see, there has been this sort of growing unity and a felt need for united action by different sections of the working people in India, and that's what you see in the solidarity actions that you were referring to.
Because what happens next? I mean, is this the end? They got what they wanted this time around and it's done? Or is there, in a way, this must be validating, right? For these workers to have protested, have been victorious in this case, but obviously there's more to be fought for and more to be won. So where do they go from here?
Well, I think this does. Yeah, you're exactly right. It does validate. It does provide some validation for what they have been fighting for. It does, while their immediate demands were met, the more fundamental issues remain. And one major thing that farmers have been fighting for, in fact, in 21, when they suspended the agitation in New Delhi, it was on the promise that government will bring a law to provide a minimum guarantee of returns to farmers, a statutory guarantee of minimum prices, statutory guarantee of minimum remunerative prices. This was a promise that the government had made, that they would work towards it and they would explore ways of bringing this about, but they have not done anything about it. No movement has happened. No discussions have also taken place. So there are more fundamental issues, the larger issues of low returns to agriculture, which remain. And I think farmers are going to be fighting for those issues in the coming months, as you would see. And as I mentioned, 5th April is the next major landmark that we should be keeping our eyes on, because that's when farmers and workers come together on the streets of Delhi to protest against some of these things.
And I wonder if maybe in the medium term, we can or should expect this to have some political impact on the ruling party in terms of their prospects. I mean, internationally, for those of us in America, the BJP is presented as sort of invincible and inevitable, in every election now. And I wonder if this kind of agitation could potentially portend greater trouble in terms of the electoral prospects as well.
Well, yes, in the sense that it does make it clear that they are not invincible. This has happened time and again. This has happened every time workers and farmers have come together and have fought like this. This happened in 21. The Prime Minister himself came on the television and announced rolling back of the laws which they had refused to discuss for a year. Similarly, this time the BJP government in Maharashtra had to the Shiv Sena BJP government in Maharashtra had to announce that they're rolling back, that they're accepting the demands of the farmers. So you are right that this does allay this kind of impression that this ultra neoliberal government is invincible because of the political conditions that they have created. But and the country goes to polls next year. So this is extremely important in that context.
Mm-hmm. Professor Vikas Rawal, thank you so much for joining us to help us sort through all of this here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, really amazing situation there. I mean, people, they marched over 100 kilometers. They were going to go 250. But yeah, farmers in India really capturing the zeitgeist there in a big way. And one thing I wanted to mention here, Rania, too, that we should have mentioned at the top of the show is big shout out to all our existing subscribers, because we did surpass 150,000 subscribers on YouTube this week. Big milestone. Yes. Thank you.
We did it.
Thank you very much.
We did it.
I don't know why I'm thanking you, Rania, but thanking the
You're
viewers.
welcome. You're welcome, Eugene. You are very welcome on behalf of all of our viewers.
Well, I'm thanking you because Dispatches with Rania Khalek is one of our best offerings on YouTube, and I'm sure that has drawn in many, many individuals to subscribe. So if you haven't subscribed, 150,000 people can't be wrong. So you might as well hit that subscribe button.
Eugene, it's also a good time to remind people, we don't do it enough during the show. Smash that like button. Smash the like button.
You should
guys.
like it. Yes.
If you're watching this right now, do a thumbs up. It helps us in the algorithm.
It does.
Press the like button. Leave a comment, even if it's just to say hi. I think that also helps. I have no idea if that helps in the algorithm. I assume somehow it does.
You make a donation just below this screen too. That also will help us reach more people.
Yes, and exactly. YouTube rewards engagement. So the more people who like us, the more people who subscribe, the more people who comment, the more people who donate, the more the algorithm prioritizes our content so that we can inform more and more people about all of the struggles that we're constantly covering from the anti-imperialist perspective, anti-capitalist perspective that we're coming from. But yeah, thank you to all 150,000 subscribers, even the ones who are subscribed because you hate us. Thank you for subscribing. Because there's a couple of them.
There's some hate followers, no doubt. And you know what? Respect. You can continue to follow us despite you don't like listening to us. I don't do that. But nonetheless.
I totally do. I'm one of those kinds of people. So I feel
shout out to everybody. Subscribe, hit the bell so you get the alerts that you get everything you subscribe to very easily. Well, we want to move to our next story here, and we're going to stick on the subcontinent, moving to Pakistan now, where there is a very tense political situation with former Prime Minister Imran Khan facing off against the current government and all of their police forces, it seems. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Azar Imran, who is a lecturer of political science at Punjab University. Professor Imran, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much to be inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back with the show. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here. And, maybe for those who haven't been fully following this here in the United States in particular, all we've probably seen is that Imran Khan is facing off with a lot of police officers. I mean, what is the issue that is at stake here between the former prime minister and the current government?
Well, I think as I talked about right after last year, April, since the vote of no confidence that was backed by the military against the Prime Minister Khan, because Prime Minister Khan had conflict over foreign policy and a lot of the national security issues with the military, who has been throughout the history controlling Pakistan's security and foreign policy. And since then, we have seen a political, economic, and constitutional crisis since last year, April, because, after throwing out Mr. Khan from power, the military also wanted to take over the control of the Punjab province, which is the largest province in Pakistan, and which makes the final decision that which party will form the government in the federation in the center because of its number of seats in the legislative assembly in the center. And there was a by-election in the Punjab in which the Prime Minister Khan won 15 seats out of the 20 and ensuring his government in the Punjab province. So pressure on to snap poll so that Pakistan could get out of this constitutional, economic, and political crisis. Khan led, his party to dissolve the provincial assembly in the Punjab, and in the northwest frontier province, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is next to the Afghanistan, so that a snap poll in the center could also be called in. So to create pressure on the Mr. Khan to not dissolve and demand the, constitutionally mandated snap elections, the government, of course, with the supporting and backing of the military and other law enforcement agencies, are registering FIRs against Mr. Khan so that he could back down from his demand of the snap polls. And till today, there were 4 or 5 new FIRs against Mr. Khan. And he, last week when appeared in the court, jokingly said that I used to score centuries in the cricket as an old creature. But right now, I'm going to score a century of FIRs on me. The most of the FIRs are, of course, politically motivated, based on bogus charges. And after following the registration of these FIRs, the police and the other law enforcement agencies, including the paramilitary force known as Ranger, which is controlled by the Pakistan military, had an attack to arrest Mr. Khan on his home, despite he was given a pre-arrest bail from the High Court in the Punjab province. And once the Mr. Khan took the route to Islamabad, the federal capital, to appear in one of his cases, in his absence, his home in Lahore was actually attacked by the police and the law enforcement agencies. And following his attacks, right now, almost 1,000 of the workers of the Khan's party, known as the Justice Party, has been arrested all over Pakistan. And even their whereabouts are unknown, because most of the workers who have been arrested have not been shown in police records, and the crimes and the charges have not been brought against him. So we actually don't know what's going on. So many of the analysts are calling that since 1971, when Pakistan went into a civil war, and the country lost its eastern wing, and new state Bangladesh was born out of that. Since the last 1971 civil war, it is perhaps the biggest challenge in a state's political, economic, and constitutional crisis.
When we talk about what's happening in Pakistan, I mean, how much of this has to do with outside interference? There have been many, claims that the U.S. hand might be involved, other countries may be involved. There's also a lot about the sort of, last time I had you on dispatches, which, by the way, I did have Professor Azhar on dispatches. I recommend people go check that out to learn more about the sort of foundational issues that started last year with the political turmoil in Pakistan, but also how much of this is related to the military, because you talked a lot about how there was a lot of antagonism between the military and Imran Khan.
Well, Ronnie, it's very clear, as we spoke last year, right after the vote of no confidence. Primarily, it was a conflict between Pakistan military and, of course, the Imran Khan. Because in the initial 2 years, military had a control over security and the foreign policy. But gradually, since Mr. Khan started feeling comfortable as a prime minister, he started to, endorse his own policy position, which he has been carrying since the 9/11 and the post-war on terror. And that was, many of the Pakistani liberals accused him being sympathetic to the Taliban because he was very opposed to the American-led war on terror. So it was primarily a security and foreign policy conflict. And the triggering point was, of course, when the Prime Minister Khan, demanded that Pakistan should stay neutral between the ongoing conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And also Prime Minister Khan opposed the Trump administration's, sanctioning of Iranian regime and also withdrawal unilaterally from the nuclear agreement, joint comprehensive plan of agreement that we had in that. So given that, it created conflict with the Saudi Arabia as well. And then the military started feeling uncomfortable. And then there came the demands and the pressure from the CIA and from the Pentagon that they were asking Pakistani military establishment to provide them the air and the land corridor for so-called counter-insurgency attacks against the ISIS or the terrorist outfits. While the Prime Minister Khan had maintained that position, that it would actually not only politically, suicide for Mr. Khan, but also it will take away his legitimacy as a Prime Minister, and he would be seen like an Ashraf Ghani or Hamid Karzai as a puppet of the American Pakistan. So Mr. Khan said absolutely not, that Pakistan will not provide any air or land corridor to the CIA and the other American-led armed forces for attacking for whatever purposes inside Afghanistan, because it will jeopardize its trust relationship with the Afghan Taliban, which the Prime Minister Khan-led government was trying to reach some kind of agreements for the broader regional stability. And Mr. Khan argued that the only possibility is that you can share the information and the intelligence, and Pakistan armed forces and its intelligences will operate from the Pakistani soil, and we will not surrender our sovereignty, because the repercussions of handing over air or land corridor to the U.S. armed forces would be huge. That we have seen the emergence of the many regional terrorist organizations, primarily against the American drone strike inside Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that caused a major conflict between Pakistan army and the Imran Khan, where the army decided to depose him, because the army was looking from two perspectives. One, they did not want that we should throw all the eggs in the Chinese basket, but they also wanted to have some, of course, financial benefits from the American establishment while providing air and land corridor to the CIA and the other. And the major conflict emerged when last time the CIA chief visited Pakistan, and Mr. Khan refused to meet him, and he said that only the Pakistan's army chief or the ISI chief, who is premier intelligence chief, would meet the CIA chief because it's against protocol. The prime minister should be seeing him. Though Prime Minister Imran Khan had a short meeting. So I think these were the major conflicts. So we don't know exactly to what extent the Americans were involved in regime change. But certainly what we could understand from history and the evidence that has come on the surface that, the establishment and the Pentagon were not on board as long as the Mr. Khan is concerned. And certainly the Prime Minister, the way the Prime Minister Khan government was taking the foreign policy, and particularly in Afghanistan and on Iran issue, the American Pentagon and the establishment, which has been very close to the Pakistani deep state, the military establishment, the intelligence, were not comfortable with. So it was an internal division of Mr. Khan with the intelligence agencies and the military, as well as military and the Pentagon might have been on the same page that Mr. Khan's political positions were not only against the strategic interests of the military inside Pakistan, but also America's strategic interests. So it was a kind of a conflict. The military might have got a signal from the US that we cannot work with Mr. Khan as long as he's the prime minister. So may not necessarily the direct intervention had come from the Americans, like we have seen in Latin America and in the Middle East, the way Americans intervened. But it was a message to the military that if they go ahead while throwing Mr. Khan out through a constitutionally mandated coup, we will be okay with that. So that was a kind of a arrangement that led to the ouster of Mr. Khan from the government. And since Mr. Khan has been out of the government, he has been on roads, organizing rallies, staging protests, and the millions of people had followed. And that we have seen in the recent polls. And these polls have been conducted by the, Gallup. Gallup is one of the, Americans extension in the Pakistan who conducts, biannually the political polls regarding the popularity of the parties and the leaders. And in the recent poll that was conducted just a week before, the Gallup, who's been very, opponent and critical of Khan's foreign policy, admitted that Mr. Khan's popularity stands at 65%, and that can easily win him a two-thirds constitutional majority that could lead to the control over the military and the constitutional reforms, and certainly, crippling the powers and the control of the military over judiciary and the bureaucracy. And that's why right now their fundamental, effort is that somehow the election should be delayed. So not only the Election Commission of the Pakistan had announced yesterday that they will not follow the constitution while the elections in the Punjab and the KP province, where Mr. Khan's party was ruling, are cancelled for 5 to 6 months, while the constitution says that the election must be taking place in 90 days once the assembly stands dissolved. So that is against the constitution. Though the Chief Justice of the Pakistan has said that they will stand with the constitution, but the reports are coming that there is a huge pressure from the military and the intelligence agencies on the Supreme Courts and its judges that they should create somehow a doctrine of necessity, an old phrase that has been very unpopular in our legal history, which has been used by the judges of the superior courts to justify military's intervention in politics. So the military is again demanding from the Supreme Court that they should use the doctrine of necessity to ensure and provide some legal, justification for the delaying of election. While there are reports in the media and the people close to the military intelligence are saying that military at the same time is planning to arrest Khan on the colonial, legal structure that existed in Pakistan, which is called as the preventive detention, that if a political figure becomes a threat to the country's law and order, you can put him under preventive detention for 6 to 9 months. So military is planning to put Mr. Khan using the colonial laws under preventive detention, while that will provide military some room to crush his popularity, to weaken his party, and then break his party to get the desired result in the election. So Mr. Khan has made it very clear that he's willing to go to jail, but he will not surrender. And following this, reports coming in the media, thousands of the workers have actually surrounded the Mr. Khan at his home in Lahore and resisting, the arrest of the Mr. Khan, which many of his workers claims is illegal and unconstitutional. And that led to the last week clashes between the police and the law enforcement agencies and Mr. Khan. And after 24 hours operation, with the backing of thousands of the police officers, still the police failed to arrest Mr. Khan.
Wow. Well, this is quite an inflection point moment, it seems, for Pakistan, and we're going to have to keep following this. And we really appreciate you, Professor Imran, for being with us here on the Freedom Side to help us sort through it all.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you people. Pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Well, wow, this is amazing. Really a great summary, and I really appreciate folks in the subcontinent staying up very late to do these shows for us. But yeah, I mean, this is quite the situation here. I mean, whatever. I am not the greatest knowledgeable person on Pakistani politics, but really the first time I think anyone has ever made this kind of democratic challenge, at least since 1971, in a way that might actually defeat the deep state control there by the military and others. So quite the situation, and perhaps part of the broader context we're in, Rania, where I think the assumptions of the 20th century are all now giving way to a very new world here in the 21st century, where things that used to be axiomatic, right, are now becoming questioned.
Well, change is coming, as our thumbnail today said, and I mean we're gonna talk a bit about that. I mean, no, the world is certainly changing in a pretty, I think, just over the last couple months. So much is different, and a lot of that has to do with, I know what we're going to be talking about next, but a lot of that has to do with the rise of China as a great power, as well as this sort of new era we've entered, where you have this group of countries with China and Russia at the helm that America keeps pushing together with its really, destructive policies around the world. And I think that we're seeing some of the changes reflected in, for just one example, the fact that China was able to broker this sort of detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran that has really been provoked and escalated by the United States for a number of years. And I never thought, I mean, had you told me 3 months ago, 2 months ago, a month ago, that Iran and Saudi Arabia were going to make some sort of peace, I would laugh at you. So I think that's a pretty dramatic shift just in one region of the world, and it's only one among many shifts. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, shout out to Geo too, by the way, for your donation. We see you there. Appreciate everybody who is willing to donate at any time. Of course, just below us there on the screen, you can donate right now in this show. But that's a great segue you made there, Rania, to our next guest, who's going to be talking to us about probably the big news of the week here, and that is the Putin-Xi meeting in Moscow. And we are very happy to welcome Ben Norton, journalist and editor of the Geopolitical Economy Report, to discuss this more. Ben, as always, great to have you with us.
It's always a pleasure being here on one of my favorite shows. Thanks a lot.
Well, to just jump right into it, I mean, obviously these are two of the most significant world leaders coming together. I mean, I think a lot of people are saying that this meeting in and of itself is something of an inflection point in terms of the move from a unipolar to a multipolar world. And I wonder how you evaluate that statement.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And at the end of the meeting, when they were going away, they said that this is going to be remembered as something that only happens once every 100 years. The quote has been reported differently, but the point is that they left the meeting saying that we're about to see historical change we haven't seen in a century. And I would say maybe not a century. I would think the change would go back to the 1940s. And if we think about how the current international order was constructed politically and economically in the 1940s, through things like the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, through things like the UN Security Council, including the winners of World War II, the permanent seats, that is, which have veto power, things like the IMF and the World Bank, the United Nations structure itself. All of these really are rooted in the end of World War II. And then you have the Marshall Plan. The point is that if people lived in 1943, 44, 45, they might not have realized that the entire world structure was being fundamentally changed. And I think that's essentially what we're seeing. The difference now is that the West will probably have its own parallel system, but we're seeing unprecedented integration of Asia in particular. And if we look at the statement written by the joint statement by President Putin and President Xi, the Kremlin released the full statement. The Chinese released a smaller statement, but they both make a few important points. And much of the media is talking about the war in Ukraine and China's peace proposal, which is important. They also have been talking about military cooperation. And let's not forget that just a few days before this meeting, China, Russia, and Iran were holding joint military exercises, which is ironic because the U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, former U.S. national security advisor, the architect of the proxy war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which helped give birth to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Brzezinski wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1997, that the worst, in his view, the worst scenario for U.S. hegemony would be what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition of China, Russia, and Iran. Well, here we are. China, Russia, and Iran are doing joint military exercises. So these are all important parts of the meeting, but I want to highlight one particular part that isn't getting a lot of coverage in the West, but I think is actually probably the most important part of all, and that is the economic cooperation between China and Russia. Since the Western imposition of sanctions on Russia, the new round of sanctions in 2022 over the war in Ukraine, we've seen incredible economic integration of China and Russia. The collaboration and exports and imports mutually, their trade has increased by 200% in the past year. And also that trade is now largely done in other currencies, namely Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble, not the US dollar. And as of the beginning of 2022, over half of Russia's exports were invoiced in US dollars. Now the figure is less than 35%. It's about 1/3 of Russia's exports are invoiced in dollars. And after this meeting, President Putin told the media that he invites countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to do trade in the Chinese yuan. So it's very clear that one of the important points of discussion in this meeting was the internationalization of the yuan and the attempt to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar in international trade and its use in the foreign exchange reserves of central banks around the world.
And Ben, I think this is very much connected to some of the positioning we've seen China in recent months, is the economic aspect of this. It demonstrates China's growing power. You even have Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're not agreeing to necessarily yet, but agreeing to at some point in the near future, perhaps sell its oil to China in Chinese currency, which is a huge deal. You have, as we were talking before we brought you in, you have this negotiation, this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this sort of rapprochement that, of course, it's been in the works for a while. There's been meetings taking place in Iraq and some in Oman over the last year or two. But of course, China sealed that deal. And that took everyone in Washington by surprise. And then you saw people really struggling, all these analysts really struggling to act like they're not upset about it, but they were really upset about it because it was something really, really big that happened in the Middle East that really creates a huge obstacle for Washington's plans in that region. And then, of course, you had China release this outline for peace between Ukraine and Russia. And I don't know if it's ever going to happen anytime soon, but it was a pretty serious proposal. And of course, the only reason that the US got so nervous about that, at least I think, is because I think China is is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, trading partner of Ukraine. So once again, it goes back to China's economic prowess. But now that we see this kind of more assertive China on the international stage in terms of wanting to be involved in at least helping negotiate peace and rein in some of the destabilization that the U.S. is largely behind, I mean, what does that say about Washington's position as we see China rise to the occasion? And you hear these kinds of statements from people like John Kirby insisting that a ceasefire in Ukraine is actually against Ukraine's interests.
Well, I think a lot of this really goes back to two historical pivots in China and the way China and Russia world. The 2000 and then the war in Libya, in which at that moment, this is before Xi Jinping was president, and this is also when Medvedev was president in Russia. And Russia and China, shamefully, they abstained in the UN National Security Council vote, which is what allowed NATO to destroy Libya as a country. And still today, Libya is a failed state. And that was another significant turning point that pushed Russia and China closer together, and also told China that there is a diplomatic vacuum in the world, and there needs to be a country that is willing to challenge U.S. hegemony, but not violently, not militarily, but diplomatically, and play a role of a mediator. And it's taken several years for the response of China in particular. Of course, Russia has been supercharging this, been accelerating this You can say, actually, it's interesting. Russia has kind of like a maximalist position, and China has always had a much more minimalist, careful, slow position in trying to slowly push these changes. But it's been supercharged, especially in the past year. And China is now fulfilling that role. And of course, the peace breakthrough between Iran and Saudi Arabia is just absolutely astronomical. It's extremely important. I mean, one, as you were saying, Rania, it gives lie to this Orientalist narrative we've heard for so long, that the reason that Iran and Saudi Arabia are implacable allies is because there's this age-old blood hatred between Sunni and Shia, Arab and Persians, Arab and Iranians, and supposedly, it's a cultural conflict, right? It's a clash of civilizations. Well, we can see now clearly that the main reason Saudi Arabia was taking such a hard line against Iran is largely because the U.S. was pressuring it to do so. And now that Saudi Arabia is maintaining a more non-aligned foreign policy, it has better relations. No one expects Saudi Arabia to ever be, a progressive force or joint distance axis, but it represents this new multipolar world where countries like the Persian Gulf monarchies can maintain a more balanced, non-aligned policy and balance the West against China and Russia. China is, of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran's top trading partner. But there's another key part of this, which goes back to what I was just saying a second ago, which is the economic element, which does not get enough attention. You mentioned, Rania, that the Saudis confirmed this January, the finance minister confirmed in an interview with Bloomberg for the first time publicly that they're considering selling oil and other currencies. They had seen reports before that, but that was the first time it was publicly confirmed by a Saudi official. And that is absolutely groundbreaking because since 1974, when Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary took a historic trip to Riyadh and signed an agreement in which the U.S. said that it would protect Saudi Arabia, and in return, this is of course the same time as the year after the OPEC oil lockout, and there was a lot of volatility in the global oil market. So in that 74 meeting, Saudi Arabia agreed that it would sell all of its oil in dollars, and then those petrodollars it made from selling oil, it would invest those it would deposit them in commercial banks in the United States, and then it would invest those dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. So there's a circular flow of petrodollars through the U.S. financial system, which is what was used to give loans to countries in the global south, which led to the debt crisis when the U.S. raised interest rates, which we're seeing, something very similar today. Anyway, the point is that moment in 1973 with the OPEC oil lockout and the 74 agreement was a watershed moment that helped create the political and economic order that we're seeing today. But now what we're seeing, that political order we saw until today, but what we now see today is another kind of shift historically. And in December, President Xi went to Saudi Arabia, and there he announced publicly that they made an agreement for China, which for a decade has been the largest consumer, the largest purchaser of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, not the United States, it's China. And in that meeting, President Xi announced that China is going to be buying oil and gas from the Persian Gulf region, not only from Saudi Arabia, but from all of the GCC members in Chinese yuan, and that oil and gas from the Persian Gulf will be listed in Chinese yuan in the Shanghai Exchange. So if they actually pull this off, it would be basically a death blow to the petrodollar system that was created in the 1970s. And I think that it's very clear, Putin in particular has been pushing very hard for de-dollarization. And the comments that he made after this meeting with Xi, I think have made it clear that they're continuing to move forward in this process of challenging the dollar. And the BRICS, of course, is also, the foreign minister of South Africa recently confirmed that the BRICS system is working on creating a new reserve currency that's similar to Latin America's reserve currency, so they don't have to be so dependent on the dollar anymore. So all of these things are happening right at the same moment. And I really think that what we're seeing today can be seen as something like the 1940s in the tectonic shifts that we're going to see, the echoes that we'll see in the decades to come.
No, I think that's a great point, and I'm glad you made the point about BRICS and, certainly the relationship to the Chinese peace proposal, or at least attempting to prepare the ground for a peace proposal. I mean, you had at the same time as the Xi Putin meeting, the Russia-Africa parliamentary meeting, where a number of 40 different countries were represented. South Africa, which has the BRICS presidency, the head of both houses of parliament were there and were given significant pride of place. They, of course, talked about the issue of peace. And then President Lula of Brazil will be in China next week. And Lula already spoke about this. He said it's already great news that China has gone there. It's good news, and I'm convinced that Brazil can contribute to putting an end to the Ukraine conflict. And of course, Lula's been talking a lot about that. So it seems like there are a lot of things shaping up where the various BRICS nations really are leading maybe more coordinated behind the scenes than we can see ahead of it. But the non-Russia BRICS nations seem to be leading a very serious push for peace that seems to be freaking the United States out, that people might actually agree. That's actually an article in Bloomberg today. It says that the U.S. is fearful that a war-weary world will be open to peace. So anyway, I'd say all that just to get your thoughts about that aspect of it as well.
Well, I mean, not to oversimplify things, but I really think it is this simple. The U.S. is a force for war and China is a force for peace. I mean, China hasn't had a military conflict conventionally, excluding a border issue with India. Excluding that, it hasn't had a military conflict since, unfortunately, it did invade Vietnam, which was a very complicated historical story. But China's politics have shifted very greatly since then. And actually, China and Vietnam have much better relations now. Is that we're talking since the 1970s. China has not invaded another country. The U.S. invades countries basically every year. So, I mean, it's clear that the president in China, Xi, but also other political leadership in China, it's not just one man, they have made the assessment that China should be playing more of an active role in the international stage, which actually is a fundamental shift, because since the Chinese Revolution in 1949, China has always been extremely hands-off and non-interventionist. Now, I mean that China is going to be interventionist in the way that the U.S. is. When it is working with other countries in this diplomatic way, it's not to support its own unilateral goals. It's to support peace and diplomacy. And of course, it's because China's ultimate goal is economic development of itself, but also it has this concept of win-win cooperation, which it contrasts to zero-sum game competition, which basically means, the U.S., its foreign policy is motivated by what it can extract from other countries in terms of natural resources, trade agreements, exploitation of labor, foreign direct investment. China thinks of things in a more bilateral, mutually beneficial way. How can we benefit, but also how can they benefit? And the only reason that China can do that is because it has a socialist government led by a communist party, which isn't guided by short-term profits. So when we look at China's increasingly active role as a diplomatic force, again, it's the complete opposite of the U.S. role. It's not that China is trying to dominate the world. It's because China wants economic development. And again, I want to stress this point because it's fundamental, because I'm not trying to say it's a culturalist difference. Sometimes people will try to portray it as, the U.S. is like culturally more violent and China's culture. No, it's a political difference as a result of the different political systems that the two countries have. China still has a socialist government. Now, the economic model is not the same as the Soviet Union. It's different. But the reality is that the Communist Party of China determines the direction of political and economic policy in the country. And they're able to carry out these kinds of policies that are simply impossible in the United States, where political decisions are determined by, ultimately, corporate interests, the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, Silicon Valley. And their interests are not peace. Their interests are more instability. And their interests are subordinating other countries to the foreign policy prerogatives of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, very well said. And I know the Geopolitical Economy Report is covering all of these various things very closely. So I hope people are following you and everyone else writing there and also contributing in other mediums. Ben Norton, journalist, editor of the Geopolitical Economy Report. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
It's always a real pleasure. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
Wow. I have something to say before we...
Please say it.
Well,
I want to hear it.
Well, I just want to say there are 642 people watching, which is fantastic. However, peculiarly, did I say that right?
Yes.
I noticed there's only 380 likes on the video. So to those 645 who are watching, if you have not liked yet, let's see that like number go up again. I'm going to be that person. That's the person I am now, who badgers the audience and like wags my finger and shames you into pressing the like button, but it helps us in the algorithm. So make sure you smash that like button if you're watching, because it definitely helps the show grow.
Yes, and subscribe, hit the bell, donate, do all those various things. We need it all to keep moving forward here, and I really appreciate everyone's assistance. So yes, we'll be happy to see those likes grow. Thank you, Rania, for your PSA there. We have we're just a couple days past the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq, of the U.S. launching the war in Iraq, or one of their wars in Iraq. They had launched one just prior to that, and they had then spent another decade aggressively sanctioning and destroying the country, and also bombing the hell out of them. People remember Operation Desert Fox under Bill Clinton. So nonetheless, I mean, a lot to reflect on. Obviously, everyone has been reflecting all around the world. I think anyone who watches any little bit of news has been there. I mean, some people are apologizing for, being involved in the lead up to the war. Some people are trying to, justify. I think David Frum and others have been out saying, no, we were right, it's okay. Others have backed off. I think Max Boot and a few others of the neocons, and how could you not? It was such a failure. Over 1 million people dead, country completely and totally destroyed, region totally destabilized. I mean, the country had the first open heart surgery in the Middle East. One of anyway, I don't want to go on and on and on, but Iraq. Not that Saddam Hussein was perfect, but so many things, completely destroyed there. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, sent abroad as refugees. By the way, remember that last stream of refugees from Iraq who were beaten back at the Polish border. Polish government didn't seem to care at all when they were Ukrainians, just when they were Arabs. But that being said, I just want to ask you, just at the top here, Rania, any of your reflections on 20 years since the start of the Iraq War?
Well, so I've had the privilege of visiting Iraq several times in the last few years, near the end of the fight against ISIS. Which, of course, was an outgrowth of the U.S. war on Iraq and then ultimately Syria, which is why we saw ISIS spread across the region. And I got to keep going back. And, I don't want to make Iraq sound like this horrible, abysmal place that's just like some sort of hellscape. People have certainly attempted to rebuild society and move on, but at the same time, the place is completely remade and in many ways shattered in irreparable ways that will not be healed for many, many generations. And on top of that, Iraq has so many other issues to deal with. It has a really inept, corrupt government that is the result of what the U.S. put in place post-2003. That's the democracy, by the way, that the U.S. brought to Iraq. Sectarian quotas and an incredibly, probably the most corrupt government in the region, where corruption is just completely built into the system. But on top of that, I would also say, and not to take away from all of the devastation, the actual human toll and societal toll of what the U.S. did to Iraq, but it's like the U.S. did itself a disservice as an imperialist power. I think ultimately, when we talk about the rise of China and the rise of Russia, a lot of their assertiveness has to do with some of the things that Ben mentioned, which is the Iraq war in 2003 was a disaster. The war in Libya in 2011 was a disaster. What was done to Syria was a disaster. And a lot of that ended up spilling over into Europe and around the world in so many ways. And in particular, what was done to Iraq, and again, I don't want to take away from the human toll, but the U.S. had essentially invested so much in Saddam Hussein being this figure to keep Iran down, right? The Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, the U.S. was backing the Iraqis, backing Saddam against this new Iranian revolutionary government that they despised. And then they ultimately ended up taking out their own ally, Saddam. And Iraq now is not some pro-Iranian power, but it's certainly a power that Iran has a really good relationship with because Iran is Iraq's neighbor. And now Iraq is home to what's called the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd-e-Shaabi, many units of which are very pro-Iranian. There's a really, really close relationship with Iran and Iraq now and a great respect for Iran and Iraq that I'm sure the Americans are kicking themselves for. And that's why at a lot of these, weapons funded in State Department think tanks. You'll see people who are like, oh, the Iraq war was misguided or was a mistake. It's not necessarily because of the human toll. They'll complain about, oh, it just brought Iraq into Iran's orbit and made imperialism in the Middle East harder. So on so many levels, there is a lot to reflect on, because the Iraq war in 2003 remade the Middle East, but ultimately I think has contributed to what we were talking about in the segment before, which is this rising sort of like axis of resistance, if you will, with Russia, China, Iran, and all of these other countries that are on that side. I mean, I think that in many ways, the Iraq war was the beginning of that era.
No, I think it's true. I mean, I think certainly in retrospect, to me, the Iraq War represents the greatest overreach of the unipolar era. I mean, I think the entire neoconservative idea, and of course, that they were going to go in and take out every single country that the U.S. didn't like. And
Right.
I mean, look, they've certainly waged war against most of them, but absolutely they have not gotten, what they wanted from it. In terms of the shifting power, and in a number of places they've actually, as you pointed out, reversed the status quo ante. And yeah, I mean, it really is just amazing that no one has been held responsible on any level in the United States on any of these things, but the U.S. still, has the chutzpah to be saying that other people should be held responsible for things. The U.S. isn't even a party to the ICC, and you have Lindsey Graham trying to get Blinken to say we should give Putin to the ICC if he traveled to America. And for a lot of people that seemed somewhat ridiculous. I mean, even Blinken said, oh, I don't think he has any plans to travel to the United States. But let's remember that the United Nations headquarters is in the United States, and the U.S. is supposed to honor that and allow world leaders to come and to be a part of the United Nations. And this essentially, is designed to prevent some of that. But, it's completely ridiculous. George Bush is out here painting watercolors and, being treated as some sort of hero or something by large subsets of the population because he said a couple negative things about Trump once. I mean, it really is. I always say, in the United States, the more people you kill, the more likely you are to actually get off. I mean, if you kill, a few dozen people in a school shooting, you probably are going to be convicted if they find you. If you kill one person in an oppressed working class community, they'll put you under the jail. But if you kill 1 million people because you're the president, then everyone is going to say you're some sort of great leader. And, it's amazing how the scale of violence seems to actually directly correspond with the lack of accountability that society applies to you. But of course, that's a power relationship question in a big way, but I think one to reflect on in the context of the U.S. going around the world telling other people how they should or should not be living. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Iraq, of course, I think will hopefully, let's just assume this détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran goes well. Iraq will obviously be a big beneficiary from that, for the electricity nerds out there. I know a lot of people will be interested to see if there's a connection of the grids of Saudi Arabia and Iran through Iraq to create a big energy powerhouse. People have been talking about that for a few years. But, nonetheless, I think that, you can see that the just really the upsetting of the region has been so devastating and so terrible. And, such an old and proud culture that so much of, our humanity really grows from that area and many different things just laid to waste. But I do think that one thing I will say, and I think to your point, Rania, is a lot of the pushback we have seen is a result of this. And that level of overreach, I think, did introduce a level of new consciousness. I think it also did have a big impact on the trust in institutions, in the United States. And, whether it be the media. And I want to also note here, that lab leak story, so-called, that came out in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago now, I guess it was. One of the co-authors was Michael Gordon, who is one of these people who lied about WMDs in Iraq. It's honestly amazing. Richard Haas, the Council of Foreign Relations, who worked for Colin Powell at the time, was like, there's an important distinction. We did not lie. We were wrong, but we didn't lie. We actually believed it. Sure. And in a way, that's almost worse. I mean, because it was, I can remember being there. I mean, this brought me into politics in 2002. It was obvious that they were lying. So, I mean, if they actually believed this cooked evidence, that in and of itself is maybe even worse than I don't know what's worse. But, it's just amazing to see people say like, oh, yes, we did terribly destroy the world, but we didn't lie about it. So you can't hold us accountable because
I really was that dumb. Like that. I really believed in the fake intelligence that we basically manufactured. I mean, it's so so incredible. And, I want to just remind people as we're talking about the Iraq War, it's important to commemorate this every single year. Obviously, this is a big anniversary, 20 years. But the U.S. is still in the Middle East. The U.S. is still devastating the Middle East. The U.S. is still inflicting horrible policies in the region that are ruining people's lives. Whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about Lebanon, whether we're talking about Palestine, whether we're talking about the ongoing attempt to try to control Iraq through various destructive policies and influence and interfere in the country because of the U.S. hatred for Iran, supporting police states, whether it's in Egypt or Jordan or on and on and on and on. It's not over. There's an ongoing war on the region that has not ended. It's not as extreme and in your face as it was during the peak of the Iraq war, but it isn't over. And so we always have to remember that. Like, the US is still this massive military empire that's capable of so much destruction, and it's still meeting it out against anyone who is unlucky enough to be born in a country that happens to be in the crosshairs of America's interests.
Indeed. Also worth noting, of course, when we talk a lot about Julian Assange now, who's facing extradition, political prisoner, what brought WikiLeaks to the forefront was the collateral murder video of U.S. service members murdering civilians there. And, that actually earned WikiLeaks the designation as basically an enemy of the state by the United States, and they're still carrying that out. And I say that as a segue because we do want to turn to the issue of political prisoners. This time, the Pendleton 2 political prisoners in Indiana who have been, just shackled for defending themselves and others from racist prison gangs. We've covered the Pendleton 2 here on this show a couple different times, and I think hopefully people do remember that. And there's more to say. We're going to be having a release here in conjunction with Black Power Media next week, and we'll tell more about that, of a new documentary about the Pendleton 2 called The Pendleton 2, They Stood Up. So before we go to our next guest from the Pendleton 2 Defense Committee, we want to play the trailer for the Pendleton 2, They Stood Up. That'll be premiering here on Breakthrough News next week.
This third time they came down there in a matter of hours. They riot gear, and this and that. Now they lined up outside Lomar's cell. Now keep in mind, you done passed up 4 or 5 more cells, but you had Lomar's cell. We in the middle. You got some more cells before you get to us. Right. Why you lined up outside that brother's cell? As I seen him going to Lomar's cell, he didn't see what I seen on the side of the wall. It was some more guards lined up. Sticks, shields, helmets, ready to do battle. They lined up, man. They got, look like guns and all type of stuff. They went in on the brother, had him subdued, had him handcuffed. And what really caused this riot this particular day, once he was handcuffed, one of the guards took the sticks and hit him in his head. Blood gas out his head. I'm right there. I got tears in my eyes because I tell him, look, give me some of that, just to take them off of him. So one of the guards said, don't worry about it. Y'all got some of that coming. You know what I mean? He said, So I look over there, no blood gushing out of the brother's head, cuffed behind his back, man.
They beat him down into a pulse with a solid oak club. Once they beat him, they drug him out his cell and then drug him down the range of the tier. He did the tier of the range for all the other prisoners to see. And everybody thought he was dead. They thought he was dead.
Hey man, somebody go tell, hey man, they trying to kill us down here. Once John Cole and them got the word of what's taking place, somewhere down that line, him and his brother named Christopher Trotter met up. So now they coming trying to see what's going on in this particular unit.
The Pendleton 2, They Stood Up, will be premiering here on our YouTube channel next week at 7 p.m. in a conjunctive collaboration with Black Power Media. We'll also be following the film with a panel discussion about the case of the Pendleton 2 political prisoners in the state of Indiana. And as we move forward here, we are very happy to be joined by Tu Black, who is the communications representative for the Defense Committee to Free the Pendleton 2 and the host of the Black Miss podcast, and King Trill, a community organizer, musician, and producer of the Pendleton 2 They Stood Up documentary. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, the honor is all ours, and this is, a very, very important documentary. Black, I'll just start with you real quick for, those who maybe didn't see our last segment here, or, when we shared the comic about the Pendleton 2, if you could just give us a capsule view of who they are and how they ended up as political prisoners.
Okay, so first, their names are Christopher Naeem Trotter and John Balagoon Cole. They've been in prison now for going on 38 years. Let's just round it up to 40. They were involved in a uprising in Pendleton Correctional Facility. At the time, it was known as Indiana Reformatory in 1985, February 1st. This was an uprising that was honestly started by the guards, who we later find out were a white supremacist group known as the Sons of Light. They were a KKK splinter group, and they targeted, as you see in the trailer, a brother named Lincoln Love, who was a jailhouse lawyer, well respected throughout that prison. They targeted him by going in his cell. As you saw, they beat him up. He was handcuffed, beat him with billy clubs. We were just listening to another interview the other day. The same brother that was talking in there, Big R, says the cell was so small, only about 2-3 people could fit in there. And there was a bunch of guards jumped in. He said one guard actually got on the bed to hit him. That just to show you how bad it was. So he's witnessing it. Him, and other inmates who were in the maximum restraint unit call out, they're trying to kill us down here. Some brothers here, what's going on? They go get Balagoon. Balagoon goes to see what's happening. Then he goes back, gets Naeem and other brothers involved who were in the documentary, Minka and et cetera. They peacefully initially go to the captain's office to just be like, yo, stop beating this man, thinking he's going to be killed because, as you saw in the trailer, he was dragged out. And they also said, y'all are going to be next. That's what they told the other prisoners. So they initially, again, approach peacefully. Then they're attacked by the guards. So they're still trying to find Lincoln Love. People get on the radio, start calling. We have an uprising. They're taking over the prison. So all of a sudden, guards are just rushing towards these brothers who are trying to save Lincoln Love's life. Eventually a melee breaks out. There's a fight. There's stabbings. They take a few hostages into cell house J. They take over the prison for about 15 hours or so, 15 or 16 hours. They have about 14 different demands that they put out, whether it's with better food, because they were just getting nonsense, more rec time, better health conditions, things of that nature. Hire some black guards because there was all white guards there at the time. And they reached an agreement after calling National Guard and media and such. After those 15 hours, they said there wouldn't be any retaliation for this. That was actually part of the agreement. Then they go to trial. It's an all-white jury in a county, Madison County, Indiana, that had at the time about 40% black people. So that doesn't make any sense. A lot of the people who are on the jury from Elkhart, Indiana, which is has always been a hub of the Klan, just for the record, and a lot of the people from Pendleton work there. They can't get any of the evidence in. So the fact that there was a white supremacist group running the prison, they can't get any of that evidence in. It's objected to by the prosecution anytime the judge grants it every time. They don't accept the self-defense angle. So a lot of the evidence that you'll see in the documentary doesn't get heard. Ultimately, they are convicted of 142 years for Naeem of attempted murder and solitary confinement. And then Balagoon gets 84 years for primarily solitary confinement. I believe they both have rioting charges too. But it doesn't end there. Post that, they spend Naeem spends 20 years in solitary confinement, and then Balagoon actually spent 32 years and 5 months in solitary confinement. And the documentary also documents some of what their experience was like in there, which as the editor of the film was probably the toughest part to edit, honestly. So we formed the defense committee about, I don't know, a little under a year ago. King Trail, started the project with making the first cut of the film and directing it. And we have a whole group of people here in Indiana and throughout the country who are supporting us. Black Alliance for Peace is getting involved and so on and so forth. So ultimately, the goal is to free them. And when we say free them, we don't just mean get them out of prison. We also, this 40 years plus has been taken from these men. So there's also other things that need to happen to make them as whole as possible.
Well, in the meantime, I mean, I think it's also important for people to understand. I'm glad that we're premiering this film, but I imagine the purpose of it is to help inform people about an issue they probably haven't heard that much about. I mean, it hasn't received as much attention as it deserves, obviously. And these kinds of things are probably still happening in prisons around the country in terms of having, KKK prison guard gangs. Every few years, I feel like there's some investigative piece that comes out from some part of the country where some KKK prison gang is uncovered, or prisoner guard gang is uncovered. So what do you hope people get out of this film in terms of not just being informed about it, but how they could perhaps get involved in helping advocate for the freedom of these individuals? And I guess I'll give that to both of you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, what we're trying to do with this is just raise social awareness. The state of Indiana, the criminal justice system here, the Department of Corrections, they went to such great lengths to make sure that this story was silenced. They didn't even let the jury hear prevalent information and evidence. They didn't even let the jury hear this stuff. So, of course, they didn't want anybody else without this whole state to know exactly what the details of this case were, because the details were so damaging to the state. So what we want to do, first of all, is raise conscious awareness and just let people know that this is what's happening in our society, and that if we stand by and remain silent, their power will continue to grow stronger and continue to damage and wreck and destroy the lives of human beings who are just trying to live in the safest community that we can possibly create together. So we want to, raise that conscious awareness and then come together collectively as a group. We've already raised over 1,500 letters that have been written by the public prescribing for the release of the Pendleton 2. All this information has been given to their attorneys, so we're just really trying to get people involved and just raising awareness so people know that these things actually go on, and that anybody who stands up to status quo for doing the right thing, you can become a target. And that is wrong, and it needs to come to an end.
Yeah, I would just add.
Oh, please go ahead.
I would just add. I think when we think about this again as political prisoners, I think as I said in a different interview, political prisoners are not punished as individuals. The point is to send a message to the group. The point is not to send a message to them, right? So the reason they have 142 or 84 years or 200 plus years together is not just to punish them. That's part of it, but it's also to send a message to all the other prisoners that you should not behave like this. And more broadly speaking, when we talk about political prisoners, that message is to be sent to all of us that you should not behave like this. And the state targets any kind of group who wants to seek out any kind of sovereignty or protect themselves or stand up beyond the way that the state wants things to go. So this is also a matter of politicizing people to think more broadly about the issues, not just their case is as important as that is, but like King just said, this could be anyone who decides to stand up, and that has a chilling effect. So things can happen. And we talk about even in the documentary, this is no judgment on anyone, but when George Floyd was killed, and we see this with a lot of folks, it's filmed and then we respond after they're killed. And in this case, I've been saying this is if someone had thrown a brick at Derek Chauvin instead of just filming it, right? This is equivalent to that. They didn't just watch Lincoln Love get killed and then protest. And again, I'm not judging anyone. It's just to say that getting people to start thinking like that, like, oh, we can actually intervene and save people's lives and not just respond to it after the fact. That is something you want to quell. You don't want people, particularly in prison, but anywhere, to start thinking like that, right? So that is something that you have to weed out if you're the state. And that's why we have to defend those things, because we do want people to think like that. We do want folks to defend each other when something like this is happening.
No, I think that is a very well taken point. And, you know, one thing I just wanted to also ask you, King, before we let y'all go, that just to pick up on something I think that Black had brought up about the challenges of editing a documentary like this and being a part of it. You produced it. You know, what was the hardest part of dealing with this footage and putting this together? I mean, it's such a striking story, and I can imagine having to do everything that goes into putting something together, you know, also brings a lot out.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, that's a good question. I think the hardest part, there was mountains of information. Okay. There was a whole bunch of paperwork, a whole bunch of eyewitness testimony, several hours of footage that has been collected, interviewing people, several hours of footage, talking to Christopher Naeem, Trotter and John Cole directly. There was so much information, and so much of it is damning. So you really have to focus in and hone in on bringing out those details that are the most compelling. But it's a mountain of stuff. There are so many things that the state did to slander and to destroy these men. You know, you have to wonder sometimes, man, should I put this in and should I do that? But still, you have to keep it in a framework that's you know, that goes along with an amount of time that people can digest all this information. So I think that was the hardest part. But another difficult part of it was, you know, in my relation, I came to know these individuals personally, John Balagoon Cole and Christopher Naeem Trotter. I come to know those gentlemen personally. And to be locked up in a hole, you can imagine. Now, these cells are the size of a double closet. And you have to live there for 30 years. There's no human contact. They don't give you anything at all. If you listen to the documentary, they say how they're stripped of even the most basic necessities, you know? So, and then I talk to these gentlemen, and they always speak such positivity. They always speak such encouragement. They always talk about life and how everyone should experience life to the fullest, Black, white, no matter your sexual orientation. These are things that these men, both of these men, they live by this, you know? So it became like very pressing on all of us who worked on this documentary. It became very pressing to us that we have to tell a story that gives them the dignity and the honor that they deserve for being human beings who actually had the courage in face of a multitude of, they knew that they were going to face repercussions and consequences, but to still act in that moment and to stand up for life of a human being, and then to expect that the state would have to side with you just because of the justness of your actions, and then to be tossed away and discarded like human rubbish, it presses upon you to do something for these men, to show that these men are truly deserving of their lives. They did something that even myself, I have to ask, do I have the courage to even do that? Other men who were actually there, they actually said, I was there, I saw the whole thing. I don't even know if I could have took the lead that these brothers did, but they did it with such integrity. And they stood up for the right reasons. And our society in no way should abandon them in any way for standing up for life. So just being able to focus and tell this story that gives them the dignity that deserve, those were the issues that were the most pressing for us. But I'm very happy to say that I really think we lived up to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, since I've seen a rough cut, can say I think so too. But next Thursday, March 30th, 7 p.m. Be here on this channel. It's a Breakthrough News Black Power Media collaboration. We will be screening the Pendleton 2, They Stood Up. We'll follow with the panel discussion. There's so much to talk about. It's a great film. Get everyone you know next Thursday, 7 p.m. right here. It's going to be fantastic. King Trill, 2 Black, really appreciate y'all coming on the show and just helping us preview this documentary release that we're going to do next week.
Thank you guys very much.
Mm-hmm. And just keep looking. We'll be promoting that. Please share it. Get everybody likely that you think could be interested, or you don't even know who will be interested, lined up. I tell you, I've seen this film. Very powerful story, amazing story. Political prisoners who have to have their story told. Just terribly, terribly unjust. But we want to switch gears quickly here to our next guest, who is very patiently waiting, and thank him for that. John Ackerman, a professor at the Institute for Legal Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, here to talk about with us about U.S.-Mexico relations. Professor Ackerman, thank you so much for being with us.
How you doing? Pleasure to be on your wonderful show. Congrats for all your work. Many greetings from Mexico City.
Right on. Well, thank you so much. It really is an honor to have you here. And, we've got, Republicans saying they want to bomb Mexico. We've got the State Department saying Mexico is destroying democracy. I mean, what is it about, President AMLO that seems to be working up the U.S. Establishment so much?
Well, I think you guys got to tell me more about it from your on side, because I don't think it's so much about AMLO, but it's more about those Republicans who are a little bit desperate, I think, about the political situation domestically there in the United States, in general, about the crisis of U.S. hegemony in the world. When you start talking about bombing, drug factories, which I don't deny exists, most likely in Mexico, throughout Mexico, also in the United States, you've reached a limit in which institutions, criminal justice, the police are not working. And you just resort to violence and to shaking that stick. I think this is more about global hegemony than it is about actually combating drugs. We have a serious problem in Mexico, of course. You guys have a serious problem in the United States. Actually, what we're talking about here is not so much, drug use in Mexico, but drug use in the United States. How many people, 100,000 people died from fentanyl overdoses last year. It's a serious national health problem, but that needs to be resolved through treatment programs, through treating this as a health problem and not of a excuse to start throwing bombs, right? I mean, this just really is over the edge for us down here in Mexico. And we're used to the United States being imperialistic, authoritarian, and trying to impose its will on the U.S. But historically, Mexico has been very much free of, direct U.S. intervention. It's not like Colombia. So in Colombia, there are a dozen U.S. bases there. In Mexico, there are no U.S. bases. It's a long heritage, the defense of Mexican sovereignty since the Mexican Revolution of 100 years ago. And so the Mexican president has responded correctly, saying that this is just going overboard. Of course, we need to work together to control the drug trade. We need to take care of our people. But somehow to imagine this is going to be resolved through throwing bombs and through the United States imposing this on Mexico is just kind of silly, right? It'd be like, the Mexican government saying we're going to go bomb those gun fairs, right? in Arizona and New Mexico, which are, we're also losing about 100,000 people a year, but not through drug overdoses, but through, gun violence, which is coming down through these, semi-automatic weapons coming from the United States. So we could say the same, you guys are killing our Mexicans. We're going to bomb you, but we got to work together. We share a continent, we share a whole region. I think this is more about politics than anything else.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. The issue here isn't actually about drug cartels or drugs or any of that. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that these kinds of comments come after this massive rally where President Lopez Obrador spoke, marking, this 85 years since oil resources were expropriated from foreign corporations, and then insisting, we're never going to be a colony or protector of the U.S. And then also this comes after after AMLO has started to nationalize the country's lithium reserves, which I can't imagine the U.S. is very happy about. Obviously, lithium is a very sought after mineral, especially, with the building of more and more electric vehicles and other things, which a lot of electronics need lithium. So all that's to say, I mean, there's also been this kind of tsunami of news articles I've noticed from the corporate press in the U.S., increasingly referring to AMLO as authoritarian and really trying to highlight that he's just this really awful, bad president very suddenly. So I'm just curious, do you think this has more to do with a fear of Mexico having a president that is insisting on Mexican sovereignty, that isn't so controllable by the United States like perhaps past presidents were, as there's another election coming up and so on?
Absolutely. So our previous president, Enrique Peña Nieto, I was just watching the last segment before I came on about political prisoners in the United States. We had in Mexico, in the last sexenio, the periods are 6 years long, so they're called sexenios, hundreds of new political prisoners were thrown to jail because they were protesting against neoliberalism, against government authoritarianism. Lots of repression. And at that point, the United States press or political class said little or nothing about what was going on, because Peña Nieto was absolutely pro-American, pro-neoliberal. He orchestrated the whole attack on Venezuela through the Grupo de Montevideo de Lima. Very much of a sort of the attack dog for the United States in Latin America. And now López Obrador has come in and sort of put that all on its head. We've had a very much of an independent international policy, literally saved the life of Evo Morales in the context of the coup d'etat a few years ago, and has been recuperating this idea of Latin American unity and the defense of sovereignty. Like you said, this recent march, not only the march, but in general, the policies of this government have been defending this legacy of national sovereignty, which comes from the Mexican Revolution. Not everyone knows about this, but our constitution in Mexico is absolutely progressive. We have a right to land, to work, to education, to healthcare. All natural resources underneath the surface of the land are they don't belong to the government; they belong to the nation, right? So it's not like in Texas where you can, drive or anywhere in the United States, you put your hole into the ground, you get those cartoons, right? That's my own little oil spurt for my wealth. In Mexico, that's just not the case. Everything underneath the surface belongs to the nation, to the collectivity. And so, yes, of course, this irritates the Washington establishment and creates these kinds of tendencies and temptations to attack AMLO, because, like you said, it's not just this case. There was the same day, about 3 weeks ago, there was a front page article in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and also I think in the Economist or the Financial Times, one of the British press, about this other march supposedly defending the autonomy of the electoral institutions, when actually what's happening is the opposite. These electoral institutions have been co-opted by the neoliberal oligarchs and are being used to attack this democratic elected presidency, and he's trying to create a more democratic process to get the electoral constitution elected. We're in the middle of that process right now, and so don't believe the corporate press. Wonderful that you guys are here getting the word out about what's actually happening on the ground. And we're in a real struggle for democracy. Because to remember, Mexico was under the control of a party state, a single party, for about 70 years. And then we transitioned to democracy supposedly in the year 2000, but it was a right-wing transition to a neoliberal democracy, which was in for 18 years. And López Obrador, the present president, quote-unquote, lost 2 previous elections, which were pretty fraudulent. So the 2018 elections were really a kind of a moment of sea change in history for Mexico, and we're trying to struggle to change things on the ground, and lots of interests in the United States are interested in derailing that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was actually hoping you could talk a little bit more about this electoral reform, which is, seems to be widely popular. And, I was there in the election in 2018, and everyone I met, at least working class folks, were telling me that was the thing they were worried about. They're like, oh, we think AMLO's going to win, but the system, we have no idea. So it seems like it would make sense you would have a reform, but the way it's been presented in the American media especially is this is somehow, anti-democratic.
Yes, this is the case. So we have a formally autonomous electoral institute. We actually, on the books, the electoral law is fantastic. It's something I've personally worked on for a long time, much superior to what you have in the United States, right? So in the United States, you have all these local legislations. You know, every municipality votes in a different way. You know, some of these weird butterfly ballots. You remember those? Or these machines, and you don't have an electoral court. The Supreme Court has to decide in the end. It's kind of prehistorical the way in which the United States organizes its elections, electoral college, etc. In Mexico, we have very modern, recent reforms which have created this national autonomous electoral institute. This is the product of civil society mobilization or the demand for democracy, particularly during the 80s and the 90s. And in the beginning, it was a great idea, and it's still a good idea. The problem is that precisely because it was so powerful, this autonomous institution, it was a big temptation to get captured by these neoliberal powers that be that were in government up until 2018. So they basically filled this autonomous institute with their representatives of corporate interests and other political groups. And now that we have a left-wing government in power, they are trying to use this autonomy against the elected government. You have to understand also that not only is this institutional structure is very positive, but also the question of, for instance, campaign funding, right? So in the United States, you guys basically have no limits on private funding donations, and in Mexico, we have very strict limits. Only 10% of the funding for any campaign can come from private interest. 90% has to come from public funding, very generous public funding as well. And so it really matters how that money is distributed, how it's organized. And we have an autonomous electoral institute, which is trying to subvert the left, right? Then we have a problem. And of course, they paint this as an attack on their autonomy, on liberal democracy institutions. But actually, when you look under the surface of the power that's actually being moving around there, you see this is actually part of the struggle for democracy. Now, I personally don't agree with every element of this electoral reform. There are some problems with it. I think there is some things that should have been talked about, in more detail in the Congress. But in general, it's nothing like how it's being presented in the international media. And these big marches are very much funded by the oligarchs. I mean, Mexico is a very unequal country. It's one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have had lots of development in the last decades. We're one of the 50th country, the largest country in the world in terms of GDP. But there's also incredible amounts of inequality, like Carlos Slim. These guys are, hanging out with Bill Gates and all the other oligarchs in the world, and so they're not particularly happy with the political change that's happening in Mexico. It's not just the United States; it's also these powers in Mexico which are trying to subvert democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor John Ackerman, really appreciate you being willing to join us to help us sort through all of this, and we'll keep watching it, but appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. And next year, 2024, is our big presidential election in Mexico, so please keep your eye on, just south of the border. Don't forget about Mexico. It's a very important country.
Yes, it is. We'll be covering it more this year and next.
Please, I'm very happy to be on with you. And there are a lot of the people I'm sure who would love to talk to you from Mexico. We got to unite forces. North America, we cannot give it up to neoliberal capitalism. We have a lot in the base and the social movements that if we unite, we can do a whole lot. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. Yeah, no, fantastic. And I hope everyone is following Professor Ackerman. He's on social media. He's a columnist all over the place. Very, very good insights. And I definitely think that is a very important point. And of course, half of America just about, stolen from Mexico. And I think nearly 40 million Mexicans living here in America. So there are already a lot of, I remember I was at a Morena campaign meeting in 2018. And the guy was like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I was like, "Oh, from the United States." And he was like, "Oh, I used to live in Dallas." And so, and we started talking about Texas and all these different things. I mean, the ties, these borders, there's so much to them. They're so militarized, but there's so many cultural, personal, historical, political ties here in North America that if we build on, I really think we can turn things around. It's very inspirational to be there during the fourth transformation process coming to being there in 2018. That big rally was in the Zocalo, the main square of Mexico City. It was almost like nothing I'd ever been to before. for hundreds of thousands of people. But anyway, I can reminisce another time on my time in Mexico for the election there. But very interesting point. But we want to switch gears here to another very important issue in the Americas, and that is the ongoing, very brutal blockade of Cuba, especially the elements that we have seen that the United States has placed Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list a few years back, which made it even worse than it already was. We are very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Kala Walsh, who is the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Kala, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can. I want to just start with this issue. You all are waging a campaign at the NNOC to get Cuba off of the state sponsors of terrorism list. I think when I think of the word state sponsors of terrorism, it just sounds like completely ridiculous that Cuba would be on this list. But maybe for those who have never heard anything about this, why has the U.S. labeled Cuba like this, and what is the impact?
Yeah, so we should go back to the history of the state sponsors of terrorism list, which was created by war criminal Ronald Reagan, who added Cuba and other countries that are enemies of U.S. imperialism to this list. And the reason Cuba was put on it was because of its support for national liberation movements against colonialism around the world. And Cuba was kept on this list until the Obama era of rapprochement with Cuba, and his administration assessed that there was no evidence justifying Cuba's continued designation on this list. And being designated a state sponsor of terrorism, despite the fact that this list is only maintained by the US government, it is still one of the most serious legal designations that a country could have, because it limits financial transactions, makes it harder for countries to engage in trade and get loans, because these other countries are scared of being punished by the US for violating its sanctions. So Obama removed Cuba from this list, but on January 11th, 2021, this was just days after the Capitol insurrection and the very last weeks of the Trump administration, Trump and his neoconservative Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, put Cuba back on the list. And during his campaign, Biden promised to revert to Obama-era Cuba policy, but he has made zero changes, and he's instead, continued regime change operations in Cuba, demonized the Cuban Revolution, and doubled down on his idea that Cuba is somehow a state sponsor of terrorism. When the Biden administration talks about the state sponsor of terrorism list, very rarely do they mention any actual evidence that Cuba is a state sponsor of terror, because pretty much all the reasons that they list for it are complete bogus. One of the main accusations is that Cuba is a terrorist because it held peace talks between Colombia and the ELN guerrillas, but Cuba has been praised around the world for its role in negotiating that peace. And Colombia's current progressive government has demanded Cuba be removed from the list. And now they're even asking Cuba to host more of these peace talks. So we know that, all these reasons are bogus. Even State Department officials from the George Bush era have admitted that is made up, and it is used to justify continuing the blockade.
And just to point out, we're being told that a few hours ago, Anthony Blinken actually said that there are no plans to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. And it really is mind-boggling why Biden has refused to revert to any of his Democratic predecessors' policies when he was actually vice president. The only thing that comes to mind is maybe there's that much of an obsession with getting the sort of anti-Cuba Miami vote, which is just, very crude political maneuvering in the United States. But can you lay out what does this do to Cuba? I mean, it obviously makes the blockade much, much worse. So can you give us an idea of how this just ends up harming your average Cuban?
Yeah, so the blockade is, as we all know, already extremely harmful to Cuba. It's stolen hundreds of billions of dollars from the Cuban economy over the past over 60 years that the blockade has been in place. And the blockade is a combination of hundreds of different pieces of legislation. It is codified into law by Congress. And so we're focusing on the state sponsor of terrorism list because Biden could change this with the stroke of a pen. And we really want to put public pressure on him about this because it is exacerbating all the effects of the blockade, which are causing fuel shortages in Cuba, food shortages, makes it very hard to buy essential products, medicines, so that Cuba has had to innovate a lot of its own medicines. During COVID, the US blocked Cuba from buying syringes for vaccines and oxygen respirators and so much more. And of course, the US wants us to think that these hardships are caused by socialism, but if you actually look at the situation, if you talk to people in Cuba, these hardships are caused by the blockade and Cuba's socialist system, and their planning that is oriented towards meeting the needs of the people is the reason why Cuba still has better health outcomes, education outcomes, social outcomes, and a more equal society than the US, despite being so much poorer because of the blockade. And I want to touch quickly on what happened today. It's interesting we chose this day to do an interview because one of the first times the Biden administration has spoken on the state sponsors of terrorism list recently was just a couple hours ago. Secretary Blinken was in a hearing, and this right-wing Cuban-American Congresswoman, Maria Salazar, who represents Miami, asked Blinken if there was any movement in the State Department to remove Cuba from the list, as some rumors have suggested. And to take a step back, Maria Salazar is a Cuban-American politician. She was actually much more friendly to Cuba when she was a journalist, but she quickly realized, being very loudly anti-communist, anti-Cuba is quite profitable and helpful for a political career in Miami. So now she is just completely owned by the extreme right. And she is introducing this bill to codify Cuba's state sponsors of terrorism designation into law so that the president would not be able to reverse it, that it would be up to Congress and make it virtually impossible to ever reverse this designation. So she asked Blinken about whether he was going to remove Cuba from the list, and he completely doubled down on the designation, said there are no plans to take Cuba off the list right now, and that Cuba would have to meet a very high bar in order to change the designation. And of course, he mentioned zero evidence for Cuba supporting any kind of terrorism, which shows that it is not based in fact. It is a completely political designation to demonize Cuba and isolate Cuba internationally. And I think someone really needs to ask, Biden and Blinken, that if they are doubling down on Cuba's designation as a terrorist state, does that mean they think Obama was wrong to change the designation? Has Cuba suddenly, started supporting terrorism in the years since the Obama administration? It just doesn't make sense. But we will not stop organizing until Biden changes his position and takes Cuba off the list and ends the blockade.
There's an element of perversity to this in a way because Cuba has been a major victim of terrorism. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that because I think it's sort of an unknown history for many people here in the United States.
Yeah, Cuba has long time been a victim of U.S. terrorism for hundreds of years. This goes back to when the U.S. intervened in the Cuban War of Independence, when Cuba was getting freedom from Spanish colonialism. The U.S. started a military occupation of Cuba, and up until 1959, when the July 26th movement won the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was ruled by direct U.S. military occupation and U.S. neocolonialism, under which there was extreme poverty, extreme political corruption, no democracy, no representation, a Jim Crow era racist segregation. And that's why so hypocrite talks about, a supposed lack of democracy in Cuba, is this was the actual reality when the U.S. ruled Cuba. And since the revolution, the U.S. has tried in many ways to overthrow and undermine the revolution, which has led to the deaths of thousands of Cubans, not just through economic warfare like the blockade and this designation as a state sponsor of terror, but also spending hundreds of billions of dollars on CIA intervention, on direct military intervention like the Bay of Pigs. The worst plane hijacking and the worst plane terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere before 9/11, which, the U.S. loves to use as reasons to attack other countries, was actually a U.S.-backed plane bombing that was led by Cuban exiles and killed over 70 people and passengers from Cuba and other countries. There are hotel bombings during the special period in the 90s, and many direct, terrorist attacks by Cuban exiles that were funded and helped plan by the CIA. And that is why it's so hypocritical that the U.S. accuses Cuba of being a terrorist, because we know very well that the U.S. is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. The U.S. is the only country that has over 800 military bases around the world. And the US slaps this terrorist designation on any countries that dare to defy US hegemony, and also against its own citizens that are struggling against oppression at home. We see that with the arrest of dozens of forest protectors and protesters in Atlanta and their designation as domestic terrorists for resisting Cop City and protecting trees from getting cut down. They're so-called terrorists because the US does not have any real meaning of this word. They just weaponize it to demonize countries like Cuba that are actually trying to build a better future for our world.
It's so interesting, too, because if you look at polling, I mean, a lot of times it's viewed as, oh, there's this like really strong Cuban voting bloc in Florida that everybody constantly has to appeal to. And that's what Biden is doing. But actually, when you poll like Cubans, younger Cubans are not in America, don't actually support the blockade. Maybe the most vocal, loud ones at protest, like at right-wing protests, seem like they speak for everybody, but they don't actually. So, not that politics is a justification to strangle a country. It's not. But I mean, I guess this is more like, let's speculate, but why? Like, why continue this blockade until now? Is it really politically necessary for Biden to win Florida if he even can? If when you poll Cubans, like a lot of Cubans don't support the blockade?
The reason the blockade, continues is very clear. Fidel said this himself. This is what the U.S. cannot forgive, that Cuba has carried out a socialist revolution right under the nose of the United States. So while the U.S. is punishing Cuba with much harsher policies than even other socialist countries, it is because of Cuba's proximity to the U.S. and the example that it shows. We have been taught our entire lives in the US that free healthcare, free education, a life free from economic exploitation is impossible and we'll never have it. People in the US realize that it is actually possible and has been realized just 90 miles away from our shore. Of course, we'd be demanding those same things here. And, there are certainly very loud anti-Cuba voices in Miami. We saw that just during the baseball game there on Sunday where the Cuban representatives were violently attacked by these Cuban Americans who are more supportive of the U.S. empire than they are of the actual Cuban people. But we're seeing the tide changing. A lot of Cubans who fled to Miami after the revolution were, the higher classes, the people whose property had been expropriated and redistributed by the revolutionary government. But now most of the immigration from Cuba is because of the economic devastation caused by the blockade. And there is a large and growing movement of Cuban Americans who say that, these right-wingers in Miami do not represent all of us. There's a movement, Puentes de Amor, building bridges of love between Cuba and the US and trying to end the blockade because, this blockade is not just a blockade of trade, it is a blockade of people-to-people contact. And it's a blockade of families and culture and Cuban food and music and all of Cuba's amazing contributions to history that we are deprived of because of this violent and inhumane blockade.
Kala, for those who are thinking you're making a lot of sense about this Cuba being listed on the state sponsors of terrorism and the overall impact of the blockade, what can they do to take action on those issues?
Yeah, so we are building a strong and growing movement against the blockade in support of Cuba, against the state sponsors of terrorism list. And I think what's really unique about our campaign is that it's uniting so many different sectors of U.S. society, so many different organizations that may have different but can unite around this issue of ending the blockade. And we're not just explicitly socialist or communist or revolutionary organizations. We're parts of all different sectors of U.S. society who agree the blockade is cruel and inhumane and that we will all benefit from normalizing relations with the U.S. and Cuba. So I encourage people to check out our website, nnoccuba.org, and our social media. We have lots of different activities. We have monthly standouts and caravans against the blockade. Those are happening this weekend. You can check out our social media to find one near you. We're doing lots of public education around debunking U.S. propaganda about Cuba. Just last week, we had a national call into the White House in which over 150 groups participated, making calls to tell Biden to take Cuba off the list. We have congressional advocacy and protests. I want to shout out Code Pink, one of our member orgs. 5 of their members were arrested yesterday protesting Blinken's war hawkishness and policy towards Cuba. We're also passing resolutions in labor unions and in city councils and state legislatures around the country. Over 77 resolutions have passed, which represent over 50 million US people. And we're also building towards a large protest in DC on June 25th, which will be paired with local actions around the country. And this is focused on getting Cuba off the list, but also lifting up the struggles to get, Syria, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Iran, which are the other countries listed on the terrorist list, because all these struggles are interconnected. And Cuba is an example of real internationalism and solidarity between all these struggles against US imperialism around the world. So we encourage people to get involved of all ages, of all backgrounds. I'm 18 and I'm one of the leaders of our organization, so there should be no barriers to people getting involved. And also traveling to Cuba is one of the best ways to learn about it. So check out our pages for all more information about those great opportunities.
Right on. 18 years old. Very impressive.
18. I know that had me go, what? That's amazing. That's amazing.
Well, definitely people should check out NNOC.org. Calla Walsh, co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
It was our pleasure.
I wish I was that cool when I was 18.
Well, as someone who did get involved in activism when I was 16, you don't
I
really have
knew
any
you were
excuse.
gonna-
You don't
I
have
should've
any
seen
excuse.
that.
You don't have any
I should've seen
excuse.
that.
You don't have any excuse.
It was tough. It was tough.
Me, Calla Walsh, we were out there. We were ready. I don't know what you were doing.
All right.
No, it's never too late. It's never too late to
Kind
do
of
the right
discourage
thing.
those.
Never
Yeah,
too
it's
late
never
to do the
too
right
late.
thing.
Don't listen to Eugene.
Listen, Toni Morrison had her biggest success after she turned 50, right? So listen, anything can happen at any time. It's never too late. Can always happen for you. You can always be, I guess, a world famous award-winning author or an activist against the ills that are facing us here in the world. One thing I want to mention before we close, that was our last guest. Thanks again to Calla Walsh. Next Tuesday at noon, Rania, you may or may not be excited about this, but our patrons will be excited about this. We're going to have a patrons-only seminar. Now, people may remember Ronnie and I recently did an episode of Dispatches about many of the things happening in Africa. Many people know I tweet a lot, talk a lot about Africa. This is going to be me answering whatever questions you have about everything that's going on in Africa, of which many things are happening. I mean, I already mentioned the recent Russia-Africa summit and obviously issues with Russia, China, Iran, Africa, the US, Europe. All of the new Cold War geopolitical currents are out there. Major things happening in many different countries, from the Horn of Africa and all those countries to South Africa to West Africa, Senegal having big protests, a lot happening there. Obviously, South Africa having some controversy over protest on Monday. Many things happening on a number of different fronts, climate change, droughts, wars, conflicts, anti-colonial, anti-neocolonial movements rising in many parts of the continent. So you can email us at info@breakthroughnews.org with any questions you have ahead of time. It's going to be something for patrons only. So you have to become a patron to find out how to join, how to be a part of it. You'll be able to ask questions there of me live with some of our Breakthrough News team helping me, of course, field them. But, again, you will be able to email us and tweet us or whatever you want to do, questions ahead of this. We're going to put this graphic that you see between Rania and I up on our social media. Hopefully we're going to do that after this show, but we'll be promoting it. But again, next Tuesday, 12 noon, we are going to have a patrons-only seminar. I will answer your questions. The name, of course, Each One Teach One, a seminar on Africa, and they will be every single month. So if you are already a patron, you're welcome. If you are not yet a patron, you better become one between now and next Tuesday at noon Eastern time, because we're going to be kicking off our Each One Teach One, a seminar in Africa featuring me, Eugene Puryear, once a month, patrons only. Going to be a great opportunity for discussion, exchange. Certainly I'll be answering questions, but I'll be very curious to hear what others have to offer. So coming up next Tuesday, 12 noon, Each One Teach One, a seminar in Africa for patrons only with myself, Eugene Puryear. So go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron, any of the levels. We're going to let you in. It's going to be great. Next Tuesday, noon, seminar. And of course, just to plug once more again, next Thursday, 7 p.m., right here on our YouTube channel, we will be debuting the documentary, very first time in history, the Pendleton 2, They Stood Up. It'll be followed by a panel discussion, and we'll be collaborating with Black Power Media on that. So next week is going to be a big week. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, become a patron. Rania, yes, I cut you off.
No, I was saying big week. This is very exciting. I love this. Well, shout out to whoever made that graphic, by the way. Excellent graphic.
Andrew.
Already a great start. Already a great start to your seminar. That looks fantastic.
Listen, I always tell him he's never made me look bad. He's only made me look much better than I probably deserve. Yeah. Excellent designer and one of our very talented members of the Breakthrough News team, as all of our Breakthrough News team is. Very talented people. But that'll do it for us here on the show. As always, Rania, it's an honor to be here alongside you, of course.
Always.
And, you know, for all of us here at Breakthrough News, we'll see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe. We did it, Joe.
Let me be clear.